general, overall, much information about pre-captivity DNA from the Israelites. So it's just a really problematic thing. You've got sort of dubious items for comparison on the modern side. You've got nothing on the ancient side, and then you say, well, they don't match up. This is, you know, you got problems. I want to say something more about John Butler. So I got kind of a kick out of the response to his article. John holds a doctorate in biochemistry. He's a fellow of the federal government's National Institute for Standards and Technology, where he serves as, and you can look him up, his resume is on the web. He's the project leader for the Human Identity DNA Measurements Group. As of yesterday, I looked, I counted 107 published peer-reviewed scientific articles. And he's a young guy in his resume, along with 2 editions of a book entitled Forensic DNA Typing, Biology, Technology, and Genetics of STR Markers, which has won all sorts of prizes and so on and so forth. If you look over his resume online, you notice such things immediately as various editorial positions in journals of genetics, an award from the British Medical Association in 2001, the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers in 2002, the Scientific Prize of the International Society of Forensic Genetics in 2003, the Arthur S. Fleming Award for Applied Science in 2007, and it goes on and on and on. Now, here's the funny part. After the publication of Dr. Butler's article, one anonymous internet critic actually wrote on a message board post that if Dan Peterson had been able to find a real legitimate scientist to write on this topic, he would have found one. Instead, he had to go to this CS instructor. I love things like that. Now, here's the other part of it that I enjoy. I've seen a variation of this line probably 10 or 15 times on the internet. People will say, look, the same DNA that convicts criminals in courts of law, although it failed in the case of one prominent one, we know, the same DNA that convicts criminals in courts of law proves that Joseph Smith was a fraud. And anybody who understands forensic DNA knows this. Well, look, the guy that wrote the book on the subject was just released as a bishop in Maryland. It's John Butler. I mean, he knows a little bit about DNA. And the funny thing is, a lot of the critics, in my opinion, scarcely know how to spell it. And so, you know, it's just kind of funny that if someone shows up on our side, and we happen to be very fortunate in the sense that that some of the finest living geneticists happen to be Mormons. I don't know why that is. One, at least, has told me he doesn't think it's sheer chance. But anyway, there you have it. And they can speak on it. But when they do speak on it, there are people who will say, oh, they're not real scientists. And so I suppose the anonymous internet critic is. Another article, Before DNA, by John Sorensen and Matt Roper, sets out the major historical, cultural, theological questions that a person has to answer before turning to the scientific issues. And even though the answers are brief, they give answers to 14 questions that sort of bring us inside what scholars have learned about ancient America during the past century, which is a lot. And it's a lot that has nothing to do with DNA. Again, DNA is simply one tool among many, and it will be a useful one for its limited purposes. But to assume that all questions relating to ancient Mesoamerica, for example, have been settled by DNA is simply naive. It's the kind of thing that pop science thrives on. Now, John Butler wrote another piece that shows up in this collection called Addressing Questions Surrounding the Book of Mormon and DNA Research. He gives an in-depth study of DNA with regard to ancestry studies. He also addresses the tensions between science and religion with specific reference to the Book of Mormon. And I want to quote you a couple of paragraphs from something he wrote in that article. And I remember hearing this item from him one morning. We were preparing, he and I, to show up on Hugh Hewitt's national radio program. There had been another LA Times article, and it had been pretty scathing about the church, and the church was on its last legs, and so on and so forth. And so some members of the church in Los Angeles who know Hugh Hewitt called him up and said, hey, come on, Hugh, that was not fair. So he agreed to have some Mormons on, and it ended up being me and John Butler, you know, cross-continental by telephone interview. And so John and I were talking the morning of the interview, and he had just come up with something that he was really excited by. And I said, whatever else you do, whatever else happens during this program, you've got to get that in, because this seemed to me so good, and this is it. This is what he wrote in the article subsequently. An interesting study reported in the June 2003 issue of the American Journal of Human Genetics leads me to believe that it is possible for Book of Mormon peoples to be ancestors of modern Native Americans and yet not be easily detected using traditional Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA tests. This study, conducted by a group of scientists from a company called Decode Genetics, used the extensive genealogies of people from Iceland, combined with probably the most massive population study ever performed. They traced the matrilineal and patrilineal ancestry of all 131,060 Icelanders born after 1972 back to two cohorts of ancestors, one born between 1848 and 1892, and the other between 1742 and 1798, examining the same Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA markers used in other genetic studies. These 131,060 Icelanders revealed highly positively skewed distributions of descendants to ancestors, with the vast majority of potential ancestors contributing one or no descendants, and a minority of ancestors contributing large numbers of descendants. In other words, the majority of people living today in Iceland had ancestors living only 150 years ago who could not be detected based on the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA tests being performed. And yet the genealogical records exist showing these people lived and were real ancestors. To the point at hand, if many documented ancestors of 150 years ago cannot be linked to their descendants through Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA tests from modern Iceland, then it certainly seems possible that the people who were reported in the Book of Mormon to have migrated to the Americas over 2,600 years ago might not have left genetic signatures that are detectable today. Now to me, that's it. It's over. One critic, responding to this very article, said, DNA is a simple subject. All that's needed is some common sense. You know, no graduate studies required, no postdoctoral stuff, none of that. Again, you wonder, can this guy spell DNA? I don't know. But in reality, as this study showed out of Iceland, the facts of research don't always match up with common sense expectations. You'd expect people from 150 years ago, we know who their descendants are. Okay, there might have been some cases of infidelity or something like that, but you know, we're talking like 80% of the population from 150 years ago has no living descendants, according to the DNA. This is just a little unlikely. And yet you can't demonstrate they ever existed genetically 150 years back. We have the church records, we have their names. Unless someone has been systematically, massively falsifying Icelandic history and genealogical records. You know, for what motive, who knows? Maybe some Mormon knowing this was coming. Might be a variation of Bill Hamlin and my little thought experiment that I've told you about some of this before. We had this idea of writing an article called Joseph Smith, The Cambridge Years. Where in order to explain all the significant ancient parallels to the Book of Mormon, you have to presume that Joseph wasn't plowing fields and pulling out stumps and clearing rocks and all that sort of stuff, digging wells. He was studying on the continent in the UK. It's almost invisible. Because he knew this was going to come. So anyway, so he went over to Iceland en route, I guess. You just have to understand that this is not a simple subject, and in fact, research has to be done. You simply can't conclude on the basis of common sense. Gosh, well, I can't find Jewish DNA in this person. This person has no Jewish ancestors, even 6,000 years ago. First of all, there's no such thing as Jewish DNA, and there's a whole lot of naivete in this sort of field. What? I won't go there. I'm just trying to imagine what does Jewish DNA look like. I mean, have a keep on its head or something. But the thing is, Iceland's a fairly simple place. You don't talk about simple. Iceland is isolated, right? The population there is fairly pure. That's why they still speak a language today that is very similar to the language of the Vikings who colonized the island. It is the most primitive form of the Scandinavian languages still around. If you want to learn to read the ancient Icelandic sagas, learn modern Icelandic, and you've just about got it. You would be able to speak with Leif Erikson and Eric the Red if you wanted to. But the Americas are much more complex, much more complex. I mean, think about the population history of the Americas. If you've heard the concept of bottleneck, you know where I'm going with this. Genetic bottlenecks happen where a sizable percentage of the population simply doesn't survive. And that happened, for example, after 1492. What happened? People arrived in mass numbers from the Old World, bringing with them diseases. that the people of the New World had never encountered, and many of them died, not to mention being killed in the wars. So in some areas,